Buongiorno o buonasera a tutti quanti, benvenuti. Siamo qui con Varvara Burton e Armando Leo, che a breve vi presenterò. Armando è uno studente universitario dell'Università di Torino, Varvara è una studente universitaria all'Università di Kyiv Mohyla e sono qui per raccontarci un po' una sorta di storia di testimonianza. Come vi spiegheranno meglio loro, agli inizi dell'invasione su vasta scala dell'Ucraina da parte della Federazione Russa nel febbraio 2022, Armando si è trovato su diversi canali Telegram a conoscere alcuni ucraini, in particolare Varvara, che lo ha aiutato a capire quale fosse la situazione in Ucraina, come vi racconterà meglio anche lui, e in uno di questi canali in cui si è trovato ad essere, un canale in cui la maggior parte dei partecipanti erano studenti universitari, questo canale era amministrato da Danylo Denysevych. Danylo era uno studente universitario, studiava cinematografia, voleva diventare regista e a inizio dell'invasione russa si è arruolato volontario, come anche suo padre d'altronde, e è caduto agli inizi di maggio del 2023. Quindi l'idea di questa puntata è, da un lato, vuole essere un ricordo di Danylo e di chi era, ma anche un'opportunità che per chi ci ascolta, molte delle persone che ci ascoltano, lo sappiamo, sono studenti universitari, per usare questa storia e questa esperienza come una finestra per capire una realtà e l'esperienza di studenti universitari o persone o persone, diciamo, della stessa età di chi ci ascolta, molto spesso in una realtà molto diversa che è quella ucraina. Su questo io cedo la parola ad Armando e poi a Varvara, che vi racconteranno meglio la loro storia.
Okay. So during the first day of war, I was pretty much interested, and I was wondering about how could this happen, and everything related to war, about why Russia started the war, and I was misinformed. Let's say I was pretty much wrong about everything, and my opinion were really not well informed. And during the first days of the wars, I started to look around for information and to understand everything a little bit better. And Telegram was one of the main way for me to get information about the war. And it happened totally randomly that I found a channel in which on Telegram, in which there was also Barbara, and we started talking about the war, and I started, and she started to destroy little by little all the Russian propaganda that was inside me because of my Italian culture and background. I mean the classic Italian propaganda of né con Putin, né con la NATO, the classic stuff that also, thanks to Liberi Oltre, I understood that it was wrong. And it was really interesting from the start to talk directly with Ukrainian people through Telegram, and I learned a lot about their culture, and it was pretty fascinating because after 1 year of COVID, that was, I think, problematic for every university student all over the world. There was, for them, the curfew and being alone in their house, not being able to hang out with friends, kept going for it kept going, and so it's really strange to interact with people of your same age that are doing pretty much your same life, if you're talking about the academic background, but then they have to interact to face problems that are that it's not right that they are facing this kind of problem, that they have to go through something that that should not have happened. So I started having having communication with in those Ukrainian channel, and I started having communication particularly with Barbara, and it has been like that for 1 year, and I shared with her some experience that I had also in Italy, like the Holodomor Memorial in Bologna, and I saw how much Ukrainian people could be happy of seeing some kind of support in other country. And recently, in the month of May, I discovered that Barbara, knew about this guy that Danylo, that sadly, has fallen in war. So I thought that this story was very interesting, and that it was worth sharing it. And I asked Liberi Oltre for this space and to share this story to a little bit wider audience than my friend and my family. And and so the idea for this video came out, and and Liberi Oltre accepted the idea, and so now I think it's the right time for Barbara to talk about his story and Danylo's story and how everything went.
So, as I understood, we're getting down to the story of me communicating with Danylo itself. It started about in May of 2022, when, after the occupation of Kyiv and after the studying was renewed. We met on a Telegram channel, the meme Telegram channel, which also contained a lot of cultural stuff, a lot of cinematography stuff. And what impressed me much more than any other is a lot of posting of Taxi Driver, my favorite movie. And I remember how we started talking with Danylo. I remember how he posted another edit with Taxi Driver, and I wrote, "Thank you very much. I really adore this movie. By the way, I wrote some academic writing about it. Do you want to check it?" He was very eager to check it, and this was how we started talking. As Armando already mentioned, and as you already mentioned, he studied at cinematography, of course, directing cinematography, and he was a very creative person from the times of his childhood, for his whole life. And we were texting for more than year, a little more than year, and we were eager to meet in real life, but he hadn't had the days off. He tried to move into the RAR, but because of some bureaucracy, he couldn't do that. And it turned out that we met for the first time right on his funeral, for the first and for the last time. But when I went to his funeral and had my first encounter with him, I also get to know his family, which is actually, it's like the continuation of him. I can really see the background in which he was brought up, in which he grew, in which he was becoming the person that he was. And talking about that, I guess one of the main traits of his that I can describe him with is that he was a person that I look up to, and I think every person in my country should look up to. He was some kind of ideal for me because his patriotism and his dedication and love to this country was very, very significant and remarkable, and he changed me a lot, and he showed me something that I can only go through way to reach him, let's say. And yeah, he was a real patriot, and on the 24th of February, when the full-scale invasion happened. He and his father packed their things, gathered their stuff, and went to a military committee to be recruited to army. And they were recruited to the territorial defense of Kyiv, and he was serving in territorial defense of Kyiv till October, and in October he was moved to the front line. And in the front line, I remember we talked a lot. He said that he felt pretty much unnecessary in there because he didn't do the important military tasks. He was more used for digitalization, documentation stuff, because there was a lot of old people in there and they didn't know how to deal with this. And so, yeah, he was spending his days working with documents. And when this happened on the 3rd of May at about 2 a.m., he was attacked, as I understood, at some kind of his base. And so, what can I say? It's very awful, it's very terrifying, especially for his parents, because everything was burnt, almost nothing left, and he was buried in a closed coffin. And his laptop that he used to, while working with documentation and working on his art project, was also burned down. And well, talking about his funeral, it's very important to mention that story that his mother told, that when he was in a territorial defense, he attended the funeral of one of his comrades, of one of the soldiers that he knew, and there was almost no one in there. And then he told the mother that the life should be lived that way, that a lot of people will come to your funeral. And honestly, there was really a lot of people coming to his funeral. I guess the ones with whom he studied with, because he participated in many different organizations, many different studies. He participated in folklore groups. He had a lot of friends in this um, drama community, actors, singers, directors, and also a lot of people from their family and the friends of their family came to this funeral. What is pretty tragic is that his some of his relatives, for example, his older brother, who couldn't came to the funeral, couldn't come in there because of being afraid of not being able to return to abroad, because he studies in Italy, he studies abroad. It's very tragic, and he is very traumatized by this experience, by being unable to go to the funeral of his brother. But well, talking more about his personality of Danylo, I came to the funeral to um, tell to his parents his will, his testament that he told me when we were just plainly communicating. We communicated a lot and we talked about many different topics. And one of the topics were his collection. He was collecting a lot of Ukrainian CDs, Ukrainian vinyl records. He was a huge fan, and he was gathering this for himself, for his enthusiastic interest, and he was also gathering this with another purpose. He said that if he would die on the front line on this war, he wants uh, to give this collection to a museum. And he wasn't certain about the museum. He was saying only two names. It's Dovzhenko Center and the Museum of Olесь Honchar. And well, I came to the funeral to talk to his mother because I don't know, I felt pretty much embarrassed and uncomfortable to write it in the text. So, and also we didn't know each other with his mother before. And so I went to the funeral, and this was how we first met with his family. And his mother invited me to their home a couple of days later to discuss everything, and it was very fascinating meeting. I mean, his family is maybe the healthiest, the most loving couple that I've ever met, and knowing what they need to go through really makes me very, very sorry for them and very compassionate for them. And well, talking about this, they also, how to say, everything in their place where they live in this village really reflects their personality and personality of Danylo. The strong ethnic folklore background, almost archaic, is very beautiful and fascinating, and everything in there is noticeably made with love. And yeah, it's very tragic that knowing that it's happened. And in this place, in the village, they also have their local business. They produce some ceramic stuff, different kind of ceramics, usually decorative ones. And well, I can also like show it. This was from the 40 days Memorial Day. Yeah, the postcard that I received. There is a signature of their ceramic workplace. Вусатый Янгол, angel with mustache. It was first called this way, but after Danylo died, they added also his name to the name of their study. And they built this house themselves in 2014, and they were very eager to move in there. And one of the reasons why they were willing to move in there is because of the bullying that Danylo experienced in his school times. He was a very shy and very special person. He was a very wise kid, and it was hard for him to fit into society, and it was hard to him to socialize in school. And it's pretty common and pretty understandable that children are, by their nature, pretty violent towards people that distinguishes from them. And they decided to move into the village because, well, in the village of Kyiv region, children are less aggressive than, and the bullying is less intense than in the capital itself. And it was right because, well, also it's important to take to the account that the social difference is also much less visible in the village. And when they moved to this village in Kyiv region, his parents, Oksana and Boris, also started participating and working on a lot of ethnic folk activities of this village. It's really fascinating. They spent 10 years working on many various projects by renewing the traditions of this small village, by coming, by bringing the life to a lot of folklore songs, folklore motifs of this village. It's very beautiful and it's very fascinating. And so, talking about this family, I can really say that Danylo was raised in love, in wise and healthy ideas, in ideals of being dedicated to this country, being dedicated to the healthy norms and the morals of the society. And well, it's very important to mention that decision to go on war wasn't his. He wasn't forced to do this. And his mother and his father tried to change his mind, but he was very stubborn about his decision. It was really something like, as his mother say, and his father also say that it's like an exam of the ideals and principles of his that he had to pass. Otherwise, he wouldn't forgive himself for not passing it.
Varvara, I would like to ask you two things. Before then, though, just for the people listening to us, because you mentioned the Dovzhenko Center. Most people listening to us won't know what that is. The Dovzhenko Center is basically the main film institution and film archive in Kyiv in Ukraine. It's like the equivalent of, I don't know, the British Film Institute in London or the Cinemateca di Bologna in Italy. And it's one of the most important cultural institutions in Ukraine. It archives and stores films from the very beginning of the 20th century. It's really extraordinary. I will put the link in the description so people who are interested can look more into it. But the two things I wanted to ask you really, and you choose which one to address first, but the first one would be, very often in the Western commentary on the war and in the way people discuss the war in Ukraine, they almost talk about the army and the people who are fighting in this war as if they are this separate thing, Whereas the truth is that for Ukrainian society, for Ukrainian people, every single soldier is a father, a brother, a sister, a mother, a son, a daughter, a friend, a colleague. There is no real separation between ordinary people and the army. Like, everyone is in this together in a way. And I think that's a point of view that it's sometimes difficult to understand from the outside. And I would like to ask you if you can help us understand that a bit more. And then the other thing I would like to ask you is, you spoke a lot about culture and traditions and how, Danylo is, of course, very artistic and very interested in this, but the connection between that and the Ukrainian identity and so on. And I think what also would be very helpful for those listening to us is to try and understand the sort of cultural revival and cultural rediscovery of cultural identity that Ukraine and Ukrainians have been going through from 2014 especially, and now even more.
Okay, I'll start with the first question because it seems a bit easier. About Western media and Western discourse separating army and people fighting in war. Well, knowing a person who's on war, I have another people who are in war that are pretty close to my family and pretty close to me. But well, Danylo was especially close to me because he was someone my age, and we were from the same generation, and it was very fascinating how well we understand each other and about our views on life that we share. Well, talking about this separation, it's like you understand that you can lose this person anytime, even though you're hoping that it won't happen. And well, each time I remember that we finished our conversation with me saying, "Let the God bless you and let the God help you." And take care of yourself because it's also important. And well, talking about this separation, I think the deal is that it's just some kind of a feeling of responsibility of the duty. I remember how not so long ago, the last week, I talked with his mother, visited her again, and we talked about this, and she told me that on the second course, like we enrolled to the universities at the same time with Danylo in 2020. And on the second course, when we were sophomores and when it started, Danylo was studying on this cinematography, and he take so-called academic vacation year. And his teacher was asking him, return to work, like, why won't you return to work, or why don't you renew the studies? And he's like, I cannot. I have much more important things to do right now. I cannot study. I cannot film anything because I have much more important things to do right now. And he really did. And it wasn't just simple words. He was a man of action, proving his ideals and proving himself. in this action. And well, separating people and army, I guess it's just from the outsider's view, it's much easier to separate them, but well, from the inside, you just realize that these are the same people who share the same cultural experience, who were brought up in the same years, who consumed the same content, who consumed the same ideas, who went through the same problems as well. And therefore, I think it's not about separation of people and army. Now we're more united by our Ukrainian identity, by understanding that we are the members of our country fighting against all of this, and everyone takes responsibility on that. Even civilians, they took responsibility by donating to army, that by going through the social activity and trying to bring some ideas, bring some messages to the Western governments, to the different organizations, international organizations. I guess everyone is involved in fighting right now in my country, and therefore we don't really separate each other. And talking about the second question about how is it important, how important this cultural revival. I remember the year 2020, when I was preparing for the exams, the final exams of Ukrainian history, Ukrainian language, and Ukrainian literature. And I was thinking about this, that I really dream of Ukrainian people coming to terms with their identity, their nationality, with some kind of common values of our country, of ourselves, because um, we can see that Russia uses this against us, and it was always using it against us. And during the Soviet times, Russia was under Soviet government, but let's be honest, it's more of a Russian government. Russia was deciding everything in Soviet times. And all of this so-called cultural revival of the Soviet times was directed for creating such thing which is called complex меншовартості, the complex of the little value of Ukrainians, which is can be described as something, some kind of disattraction to your own culture by seeing how low it is, by seeing how stupid it is, by seeing how it's more vulnerable and humiliated comparing to other cultures. It's like persuading people that you have culture, but look at this, it looks so gross, it looks so awful, you don't want to participate in this, and therefore you don't want to participate in any cultural renovation of your country. And during the first decades of independence, it also was a problem because, well, we also had a lot of cultural pressure from Russian side, which continue to keep on putting the pressure on this complex of the little Volga. And the year 2004, the Orange Revolution started, some kind of Ukrainian realization of themselves, realization of who they are, realization of their values, and the realization of necessity of kind of worshiping, not worshiping, but saving this values and this mentality. Then the year 2014, it's almost about the same problem. It's about the influence from Russia. It's about corruption. It's about people not willing to be treated as a slaves by the government. It's pretty much the same topic as the Orange Revolution. And this time it was better because there was also cultural background put by on the president Yushchenko before Yanukovych. He really made a lot for the cultural condition of our country. This I can say as a culturologist. He really did a lot, even though he wasn't perfect. And talking about events that are happening now, it's like I can say that it's like an open sore. It's like something that became just a necessity. Like after 2014, a lot of people thought that this conflict, this military action, the war that is going on in their country is located in on the east, and they can just not pay attention for this, and therefore they kept on consuming Russian language content. They kept on consuming Russian culture, and because it didn't touch them personally. But now the war, this full-scale invasion, touched each region of Ukraine, because each region is being attacked, each region is being bombed, and therefore it just became a necessity. And talking about this culture and Ukrainian identity, I guess it's something like each person comes to this, and the wise people comes to this in a more light way, with their own will, and other people who are not that wise are coming to this by violence, by being um, harmed by Russian aggression. And talking about this cultural identity, I guess it's something like something that is becomes a key for us to create a strong national state. I mean, a state that can survive on itself, that can provide the country with some force, some power. Because honestly, I guess discovering and this cultural revival is a key to understanding what a responsibility on each of Ukrainians. And responsibility is something that I can feel on myself. Like after reading many times, restudying the history of Ukraine, I can feel how much of responsibility lies on my shoulders, because I'm the person who was born in the independent Ukraine. And this is the privilege that many centuries, many generations of Ukrainians didn't have. And I have to not only be grateful to my ancestors for giving me this gift as being born in independent state, independent national state, but also I need to do my best to save this, and each Ukrainian should do their best to save it, because otherwise the history will repeat one more, and the history of sufferings, of the loss, of the grief will just keep on repeating itself. That's it.
Thank you, Varvara. That was really inspiring and interesting. And I thought you explained it in a very articulate way. I wouldn't add anything to it. The only thing I would like to do, for those who listen to us who may not be familiar with some historical elements, just to expand on some of the things you said. I think what you were referencing was the idea that throughout the centuries, both in Imperial Russia and then in the Soviet Union, in the very few times when Ukrainian art was able to express itself, like for a very brief period of times, it was then very often then labeled as Russian and appropriated by Russia. Like, you hear things like Russian avant-garde, it's really Ukrainian avant-garde, for example, and things like that. Or later on, the notion that the only possible, Ukrainian identity is a little Russian identity, a local identity, a like a folkloric identity that is not really national, that it's a bit funny, that is a bit lower, that is that doesn't deserve the level of respect and importance that the Russian identity instead did. And this was very typical of the Soviet Union, which is something that a lot of people outside, never fully appreciated. And I think that the problem with that is that it was also successful abroad. And, still to this day, if you go to museums in Western Europe or in other parts of the world, you would still see, bits of art that, were produced by people who are Ukrainian or called Russian, for example, or things like that. Or, the famous, well, now renamed Ukrainian dances by the Guard, were labeled as Russian dancers, although they're of course Ukrainian dancers, because you can tell from the clothes they're wearing, from the dance they're dancing, they're obviously Ukrainian. So that's part of, I think, of what you were. I think there's a bit of context that will help some of the people who are listening to us who may not be as familiar with Ukrainian culture. One thing I would like to ask Armando instead is, Varvara spoke of, the relationship between the people and those who are serving in the armed forces in Ukraine, and with this cultural revival. You mentioned early on that knowing Varvara was an opportunity for you to learn a lot. Can you expand on that? Like, what have you learned, and how was this helpful for you to understand Ukraine better, and especially how does that compare to the perception you had before as an Italian, as someone with a different cultural background?
So, yes, first of all, I was really ignorant about everything related to Ukraine, and yeah, I didn't know anything about the country except it existed, and except some general information about Crimea, because of the event in 2014. And yeah, so basically, talking to Barbara, first of all, there was a period in which I started to learn the basics about Russian politics towards other country, and Soviet Union time period in which, like when you read about news, and when you read about history in books, it's how to say, sometimes doesn't seem real that while my parents had television in their houses in the 70s, 80s, that there was such a different world at the same time, not so distant from Italy. And yeah, talking to someone living there, telling you about how was it to live in Soviet time, because Barbara had his grandparents and his parents living during the time. And yeah, it explained a lot, because it explained why people try to escape from USSR during this time period. And it served at the start I had to destroy all my idea about politics, because as every university student, I wasn't really into politics. I wasn't really a political activist. I can say I was neutral to politics, in the sense that the average opinion in Italy for students about politics is to be some kind of leftist, let's say, some kind of socialist, and having strong opinion without having strong evidence, and without having a strong background in studying in those topics in which every student has very strong opinion, especially in Turin, especially in city like Bologna. And to this cultural background of mine in politics, there is also to add the Southern Italian cultural background, let's say, in which there is this stuff that can be expressed with the words with the words that I don't know, like Spagno, Francia, Burchese, Magna. I mean, this classical stuff in which you don't give you are not interested in what happens around you. You only think about your wealth and yourself, and you don't really care about anything else. So why helping Ukrainian if we have to pay much more for gas, for example, and all this stuff? And I have to say that propaganda in Italy, Russian propaganda in Italy, was working pretty well on students, on university students. So at the start, there was this strong impact, because for the first time I was talking with someone that was under all of this pressure, and it was really strange, because if for the first hour and days of conversation, it was like reading some news. By knowing Barbara as a person, I understood that she was a 20-year-old girl like me, just going under an enormous amount of pressure, facing something that is really unbelievable. There are a lot of stories that Barbara told me that are really, how to say, terrifying, and and thinking that this is a person of my age, just studying at university, just planning about her future, just dreaming dreaming ordinary life, and not being able of this just because of Russian aggression. Yeah, it was really unbelievable. And yeah, let's say that I discovered also a lot about Ukrainian culture. I understood how important is to have a culture about your nation, not in the sense that you have to be an extremist, an extreme nationalist or stuff, but in the sense that it gives you the importance of it can having a strong identity and related to the nation to which you belong can make you understand why things work or what works about your country, what doesn't work. For example, in Italy, why in Italy things went so different if we compare Italy to other European country. And so I really understood a lot about Ukrainian culture because I was pretty ignorant. I didn't know a lot about Ukraine, and I was every day comparing this to how I approached the Italian culture and stuff. And really, you can see how culture influences everything about the country. And yeah, it was really interesting. I think that the most interesting stuff was the how to say the humanitarian side of this communication, because it's not everyday life that you can talk, that you can have a deep conversation with a person that is living through something that it's unreal for us, because we live in a very safe country in Europe. For example, I was like every university student, and I think the average person in Italy, I was against any kind of military expense for military funds from our government, because it's like, why we have to spend money for stuff related to war, why we have to spend money and for military stuff when we have not very good healthcare, for example. The usual stuff that when you ignore how things work outside your country, that when you ignore how things really work, you think that it's useless to have military equipment that works for your country. You don't really appreciate and understand what does it mean to be in the European Union. You don't really understand what it means for a country to belong to NATO. And and not understanding all of this makes much easier for Russian propaganda of the NATO expansion, of NATO being aggressive toward Russia. Yeah, it makes you really understand why this propaganda is wrong, why it doesn't work like that. And I felt really embarrassed after a couple of months of communicating with Barbara, because I understood how stupid my view were and how naive they were, and how I and how strong also my views were in the past, because there is this common stuff in Italy that when you know very little about something, you have very strong opinion. It works quite the opposite. Yeah, and so it was really interesting to learn, to listen, to see how people facing much stronger problem than you can keep going, and and I think that for as much as I know of Barbara is really is an example of Ukrainian talking about strength and going through many things, facing problem. And it's, for me, it's unbelievable when sometimes I reflect about Ukraine as a country, because it's unbelievable how Ukrainians keep going, keep fighting. And when I compare how we in southern Italy, especially, but I think also it's a general. I think it's general all over Italy, but it's if you compare how Ukraine reacted to all of this and how we in Italy react to problem, how we in Italy postpone facing every problem, how we in Italy, like for example the mess, I mean, it's such a different attitude, and yeah, it makes you really understand how much Ukraine is fighting, not for some abstract freedom, not for some abstract stuff that propaganda wants to tell us. It's not about Zelensky versus Putin. It's not about two nationalist country, two extreme nationalist countries. It's not about two far right country fighting each other. It's about Ukraine that want to survive, want to keep going, and when you talk to people that are living that country, that are facing having their habitudinary life destroyed, literally destroyed by this invasion, really makes you understand that it's not about propaganda. It's not about controlling. I don't know. It's not about a war about. It's not a war about money or control over land. It's a war in which there is Russia that is that it's aggressive, and Ukraine that it's achieving, it's defending itself against the aggressor. And it's I'm sorry if I'm getting a bit emotional, but that's it. So I don't know, did I respond to the question?
I think you do, and you did, and I want to thank you for having been really honest. It takes it takes courage to say some of the things you said. It's about one's own opinion and how you change your mind. I wanted to ask something to Varvara. Of course, if you have anything to add to what Armando said, please feel free. But then also one thing you said earlier that really captured my attention was, you mentioned you were born in independent Ukraine, clearly, and probably I assume your grandparents were born in the Soviet Union, and you feel like this level of responsibility, which I would like you to go back to that at some point and try to help those who listen to us to understand. You're a culturologist, so you can probably expand on that quite eloquently. What does it mean to be born in independent Ukraine, and what's their responsibility?
Well,
it's a big question, I know. But
also, I would like to mention the words that you said about Russia appropriating Ukrainian culture. It's not the worst case. The worst case is like what happened to the repressed Renaissance, as it's called, the Ukrainian artists of the 1920s. They were not only killed, all of their works were destroyed. And the Soviets tried to do everything to erase them and their trace completely. And that's it. That's it. A lot of generations, a lot of artists, a lot of painters, cinematographers, actors, singers, other musicians. They didn't even have rights to express themselves while identifying as Ukrainians. For example, also, I remember it was the year 2020 when I discovered one of my favorite Ukrainian musicians, Volodymyr Ivasyuk, the one who wrote Червона рута. This is one of my favorite singers at all, and because he has very, very nice lyrics, he has very nice musical stuff. Like, it's really pleasant to listen to. And I remember when I was like digging into his biography, and I just found out about how he died. he was tortured for a couple of days by special services of Soviet Union, by KGB, and he was tortured. His whole body was covered in bruises, and his eyes were just ripped off, and they hanged him on the rope in the forest, in the position that a person cannot hang himself. And oh my God, it should be censored maybe. No, sorry. And in this position, they claim that it's suicide. A person decided to stab himself, I don't know, to beat himself up, to put out his eyes and kill himself. And what was even worse, he was also buried in a closed coffin, and people were coming to his funeral. A lot of people, because, well, a lot of people appreciated his talent and him for what he did for Ukrainian culture and for everyone. And police just started, how to say, aggression against the people who were attending funeral. And it's insane. Like, it got me so mad during this time. And stories like this, there are too many of them. There are too much of them. And for example, my favorite poet died in the prison for so-called nationalist rioting, for fighting for independence. He died, and his body wasn't given to relatives and for his friend for 5 years until his prison sentence ended. And this is just this is so awful. And by the way, this my favorite poet of my dissident, Vasil Stus, I was talking about. He was also, like, the ceremony of farewell with him was happening in Mikhailivsky Sobor, in Mikhailivsky church, in which there was also was funeral of Danylo. And when I was going to this funeral, I was remembering the documentary photos of my favorite poet, and it's just realization of the fact that it's not happening for the first time. And also, I remember when I was visiting a grave of Danylo, bringing the flowers in there, and I was just thinking about a lot of students of schools, Ukrainian schools, complaining that the program of literature is of Ukrainian literature is too much concentrated on suffering, on the grief and the feeling of loss. And I was just realizing that I'm experiencing the same grief and the same loss that was touched in these songs and many folklore songs and many Ukrainian works and many Ukrainian literature works and the cinematography works. And yeah, that's it. It's just realization that it's happening all of the time, and that being born in independent Ukraine, being able to talk your own native language, being able to study it in schools, because, well, Russia always cries about Russian language people being oppressed. Yeah, and the logical question, are there a lot of Ukrainian language schools in Russia? There are none of them. And the last ones are being closed and are being repressed. And the folklore groups of Russia that has some relations with Ukraine, like the one in Manchuria, where was Zelený Klin, the green place where was Ukrainian migrants coming in the 19th century, or for example Kuban, which was pretty close, which on the shore of Azov Sea. And Russia oppresses Ukrainian language people much more, honestly. And understanding the privilege of me being able to identify myself as Ukrainian, which I am, and being able to read about history not being lied by the totalitarian government, being able to to be a civilian of this country, to participate in the life of this country, to help this country to grow, is a huge privilege. Understanding many centuries, many generations that had gone through oppression and had gone through death. And this responsibility that I feel is not only about the privilege, it's also about me wanting to pay some gratefulness to all of these people who put their lives for this. I guess it's very important. It's some kind of a feeling of a duty, not only responsibility. And Danylo also had this feeling. And yeah, it's a big pity that it happened to him, because, well, when just an ordinary person dies, it's a tragedy. But when an artist, when the creator dies, it's even a bigger tragedy, because it's also a lot of lost potential. And well, I also want to talk a bit more about him, and that about his personality and about ideas of him. For example, it was pretty interesting that he said that death doesn't exist. That when a person is being born, it dies in another dimension, and when it dies in this world, in this dimension, it being born in another one. And these ideas really help his parents right now to go through this. And they are looking for his traces through his childhood notes, through a lot of his works. And his parents are looking very accurately for each work of his that remained of him. Because, well, a lot of works also remained on this burned laptop of his, and they really try to save the memory of his, and they really try to not only save the memory, but also kind of fulfill this potential of his, I guess. It's something about this as well. And yeah, it's very important. It's very important. Yeah.
Just a couple of things on some of the names you mentioned for those who are listening to us, because you mentioned, of course, you mentioned Volodymyr Vasyuk, songwriter, composer, and poet, and Vasyl Stus. We spoke about Vasyl Stus several times on this channel. But just for those who are listening to us, they were both killed by the Soviet authorities. This was not in like the 1930s or anything like this. Vasyl Stus was killed in 1985. So this was happening like in very recent memory. And Armando was speaking about the difference of the life that people would have in the West in the 1970s. Yeah, a lot of people maybe who are listening to us will remember the 1980s, and while they were living in Italy or other countries, there was the experience of an artist in the Soviet Union, of a Ukrainian artist in the Soviet Union. So I think that's important to keep in mind. It's not just about the distant Stalinist time, but it's until very recently. And I don't know if Armando wanted to ask something. I'll let him.
So I wanted just to say that a perfect example of the difference of attitude between that I found between Ukraine and Italy, for example, is the sense of responsibility that Barbara was talking about. Yeah, it's something that really sums up everything a bit. It explains a lot about about the feeling that I had while talking to Barbara, while she was talking about the war, how the country reacted to war. I think that in this moment, and this is a concept that I know that Libri also try to express in many ways on various occasions on this channel, but yeah, the sense of responsibility really lack in Italy. I mean, students don't want, they give everything for granted. There is no aim to understand how things work, how a country work, and yeah, there is no sense of responsibility. I mean, it really this really miss, and it's compared to Ukrainian sense of responsibility toward the country, and how, yeah, it really, I don't know, it was a strong experience for me, because we give everything for granted. We don't understand what really protects protect a democracy, what the democracy is based on, and giving everything for granted, you really risk to lose everything. And that sense of responsibility that Barbara has really lack, for example, in the background of an Italian student, because you are never thought of thinking about that democracy is not something that that just exists. I don't know, randomly in a country, but it's something that people in the past built, and something that I really that makes me really reflect is when Italian people say, how is it possible that in 2023 something such a tragedy can happen? And they don't understand that it's not about being in 2023. It's about that in Europe this stuff was not happening, but not because it's 2023, but because there were people, there were staff people and organization protecting and trying to avoid this stuff, and but we as European, we didn't enough, and we're not doing enough probably. But the lack of sense of responsibility really is the main difference. So that's something that really, I don't know, really comparing Italian sense of their sense of responsibility for Italians and for Ukrainian, it's really a strong difference. So sorry, I wanted just to add this.
So, by the way, this phrase about how can this happen in 21st century, I also often hear it from other Ukrainians, especially from the older generation that lived in Soviet Union. Like they keep on asking, how could this happen in 21st century? And sometimes it gets me really mad, and I started saying, well, where were you when it happened to Transnistria, to Chechnya, to Georgia? Like it happened to every Russian neighbor. And one of the reasons why Italy is so peaceful and takes peace and democracy for granted is that it's pretty lucky to not be neighbors with Russia, not have border with Russia. It's a real privilege, let's say, because many neighbors of Russia can really relate to this. And talking about the responsibility and historical stuff, like living in major historical events. Well, I can say that every generation of Ukrainians that modern Ukrainians remember, like for about 5-6 generations, 7 maybe, they have these traumatic experiences of being oppressed, of being treated this way by the same antagonist, let's be honest, by the same people, by the same state of Russia, because it always remains the same in these attitudes towards people. Like, for example, I can remember my ex telling me how his great grandparents were sold as slaves before Kripachество, before the slavery was cancelled in Russia. It was cancelled only in 1961. And many people don't remember it because of artificial starvations, 3 artificial starvations of 20s, of the 30s and of the 40s that happened during the Stalin times, because it was aimed to erase the memory. But also there are a lot of vivid and painful memories from not so long ago. For example, I talked to a person who had a mother-in-law, and his mother-in-law from Lviv, and she had relatives burned down in their house for being suspected in the relationships with Ukrainian partisan nationalists. And Also talking about my family. For example, I never knew my grandfather because he was repressed by KGB because of being Protestant, just because of being in Christian organization. Yeah, and it wasn't so long ago. It wasn't about 70s. It wasn't about 70s. Another grandfather of mine died because of radiation, because of working on Chernobyl. And yeah, it's pretty vivid. It's pretty fresh memory, and it's something that every Ukrainian has some personal trauma, some personal experience of oppression, of being treated this way, of not being considered a human. Because I don't think Russia considers anyone except Russians humans. Yes, that's it.
One thing you mentioned is a sense of trauma, which I would describe as generational trauma. It's generations and generations of trauma that are like accumulated, and it's trauma that is passed from one generation to another, which has an impact on the way people grow up and the way they perceive themselves and the way they perceive life. I think that's very important to underline. And what the war, Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, has added an additional layer of trauma to a full generation, to every Ukrainian who's alive now, because obviously every Ukrainian who's alive now is being affected by this war and will know someone who might have died or might have been, affected really directly by it. And you do hear at times people saying, in Ukraine, of course, one of the important reasons to fight this war is so that it doesn't need to be fought again, so that this is like the final way to really solve, to really decouple Ukraine from Russian imperialism and colonialism. How do you think this is affecting the way you and your generation perceive themselves and perceive the future of Ukraine?
I was just about to say that I'm pretty happy to be born in independent Ukraine and I don't have generational trauma, but then I realized that I'm surviving in a year of war. It was a bit uncomfortable. Well, honestly, talking about how do I experience this, how it's, what impact it has on me, well, I have some kind of more cynicism maybe, because, well, I just realized on about fourth or third months of war that peace is not the right of a person. Peace is just a privilege. It's a privilege that you live in the peaceful country that doesn't have borders with Russia. And talking about how does it impact my generation, how does it impact people, well, let's be honest, it's pretty scary to understand that you can die, to hear the explosions very near. Like, I remember recently, about a couple of days ago, there was an explosion near my house, and but there was no air raid and there was no news about it. And I was saying Armando, "Oh, there was an explosion." He was like, "Why didn't you call me?" And I said, "It was just an explosion, nothing serious." But honestly, today we also was talking about this, about the risks of dying, because, well, there are news about mining Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and I was like, oh my god, I don't want to go through this. I don't really want to go through this. I don't want really this to happen, but I'm not going to leave my country anyway because I love my country. And, well, yeah, honestly, I'm realizing that I'm not afraid of death anymore, because, well, I guess there are much higher purposes in life, much higher values in life than a life itself. Because I realize that it's much more important for me to live a life full of dignity, full of honor, life full of good things that I did to other people and that I experienced myself, rather than to just keep on being alive. And, well, in those scary nights when the explosions are very near, very close, and I really feel this risk of death, I do think if I had a, a decent life, to end it right now. And I'm just answering, of course, it was pretty fine. It was pretty fine. And talking about, for example, Japanese narratives of Ukrainians, why don't they surrender? Well, I can also uh, answer to this with a quote from Ukrainian classic literature book, which is called Tigrolovi by Ivan Bakhriani. It's better to die while you're running rather than it's better to die while you're running rather than live on your knees. I guess, yeah, democracy, freedom, it's it's much worth much more than life, and understanding that the lives of the following generation can be better, that you can improve them, that you can really really participate in Ukraine to be peaceful again, to to become maybe as peaceful as European countries. That's a dream of every Ukrainian, for Ukraine to be as peaceful as other countries, for example, as Italy, and to take the freedom, the democracy, the normal institutions as something granted. To take, I don't know, some protection of the civil rights as something granted. Because, well, in Russia, it doesn't exist. And honestly, well, a lot of people start saying that not all Russians are bad and stuff. And I'm saying, like, of course, I don't mind them loving autocracy in their country. I mind them intruding in my country. Like, if they like this kind of living, if they like to be treated this way and not fighting for their freedom, I'm completely okay with this. I'm not okay with them interfering. I'm not okay with them taking my freedom because, well, I'm not I'm not them, let's say. And my people are not them. And it's very important to understand.
Thank you so much, Robert. And to come to a close, I would really like to close with a final note on Danylo and a few words on him. If you've had the opportunity to learn about him, and you've told us a lot about his life and his personality and his ideas, but if there was something you wanted people to take away from him that you would like everyone to know.
Well, I have several things that I would like to tell about him. At first, it's the prayer that he wrote when he was a child. And, well, it's, how to say, it's located on this postcard of his from another side. It's a print, it's a scan from his childhood note. It's written in his handwriting. I'm the butterfly, I'm the love, I'm happiness, and I'm compassion. And nobody never kill it in me, destroy it in me, because my molecules are fulfilled with atoms of love, and my bones will never, ever shake from the anger. It's very beautiful, and it says a lot about him as a person that he was in his childhood. He was really a person of love, a person of something very high and sophisticated. And, well, I want to show something, but, well, I need about 30 seconds. Yeah, okay.
So I can add something like related to your question to how war will influence Ukrainian. I think that
I want to show this. This is the small ceramic house that Oksana gave me as a present. Yeah, it has a bit of soil because I kept it as a plant. So, the story is when Danylo was about 16, 17, not so long ago, he had two vinyl record players broken, and he needed a new one. And he came to his parents saying that, well, I need a new record player, vinyl record player. And they say, we cannot afford it, but well, you can make money on your own by working in our workshop. And he was making these small houses to sell them and to make money on this record player. And they keep saving these small houses that he made, that remained of his, on the windowsill of their house. And yeah, he really made money on this, and a lot of people were touched by this, by him making money on this. And one more story is about his parents. They were going through his notes. They were going through his child belonging. He was writing the small books when he was a kid. It's very cute. He was illustrating them, he was writing them, he was making up the stories himself. And they found in one of the books a little convert, and in this convert there was a letter for the parents that he wrote when he was about 10 years old. And he wrote in there, "Parents, I travel good." And when they found this letter, they really tied this to what happened, and it makes them feel better. And they say that Danylo tricked them all for making them look for traces of his, for his messages, for his mission on this earth. And the last thing that I would like to end up with is that each time that mother called Danylo when he was on war already, she was calming him down, saying that everything will be all right, and he was answering to his mother, "In any case, everything will be all right."
Thank you. I think that's a good point to end, unless Armando wanted to add something. But otherwise, I would really like to thank you, Varvara, for the story of Danylo, but also, and I think we would have all loved to meet him, and I think it's the injustice that we will never will. Although I will add to the description of this video some of the things he's done and some information about him, so whoever is, everyone listening to us can look it up and learn more about him and about who he was and the person that he was. But I would also really like to thank you for for the thoughts and the ideas that you brought us. I think you really spoke very eloquently about the meaning of Ukrainian resistance. So I hope that will be helpful for those who listen to us. And thank you to Armando, who brought this story to Liberi Oltre, because otherwise we wouldn't have known of it, and for your honesty in saying the things you said. I think that takes a bit of courage to do it, and not as much as being Ukrainian, but still. So yeah, thank you both, and Все буде Україна.
Все буде Україна.
Слава Україні.